Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today I'll be talking about some of my experiences working in the Internet and Technology Policy Group for Verizon in Washington, D.C. In this presentation, I'll be going about briefly how I got involved in ICTD policy, and then I'll explain some of the goals and deliverables for my practicum, and towards the end, I'll talk about some of the learnings and skills that I've acquired over the last 3 months. So I've been designing technologies for developing world problems since the summer of 2009, and I've put some of the projects that I've been involved with in different groups and different settings for over the last 4 years over here. And a lot of the projects that I've been involved with haven't scaled. And apart from maybe the low-cost water purification system that one of my partners is working on in India right now. And so I've been asking myself this question: why don't my projects scale, or why don't ICTD projects scale? And one of the answers that I keep getting again and again is there are bigger problems that need to be addressed, there are bigger issues that you need to deal with, and there are bigger questions that need to be answered. And so, for example, Dr. Ravi Sterling, her PhD dissertation in interactive community radios would not be applicable in Pakistan because there are policies in place that ban interactive community radios in Pakistan. And so I wanted to develop a skill set to find out why you have to pay a lot more for slower broadband in communities where the average income is already lower. And so that's how I started this program, and I got involved with ICTD policy over here. And as Ravi mentioned, I'm a Fulbright scholar from Pakistan, and one of the biggest goals of the Fulbright program is to bring scholars from developing countries to the US so that they can develop skill sets over here and then go back and solve those problems in their home countries. Pakistan faces immense challenges in the internet and technology policy sphere. Some of them I put on here, but there are a number of issues that they really face. One of them is the broadband speeds in Pakistan are really low. The average is about 780 kilobits per second, and the global average for broadband is about 2.8 megabits per second, roughly about 4 times as much. And this is because of lack of competition in the wired broadband market space, and it also hurts innovation. And you might just ask, and the second problem that Pakistan deals with is they still have an auction 3G spectrum. You might ask what spectrum really is. It's essentially a range of frequencies on which electromagnetic waves operate. And the radio spectrum is very scarce. And so the government tightly regulates it. You just can't set up your Wi-Fi router on any frequency you want to operate on. You have to take permission from the government. And so Pakistan has not, the Pakistani government has not given authority to the ISPs to operate in the 3G spectrum space right now. In terms of the US, these are common issues with the US as well. The ISPs have been constantly criticized for having slower broadband speeds in the US compared to the rest of the developed world. And the FCC is re-auctioning, or through incentive auctions, is reallocating the broadcast spectrum on which broadcasters such as NBC or ABC operate to the ISP so that we can have higher speed mobile broadband. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to work at Verizon in DC, find out these policy issues, find out how to design policies, and work with such policies so that once I go back to Pakistan after I graduate, I'd have the skill set to do so in Pakistan. One might ask, why is broadband important for a common person in a developing country? Why is it so important to have high-speed broadband? Higher speed broadband does not just mean loading YouTube videos faster. It actually does help with connectivity, and Iqbal Qadir, who's the founder of Grameenphone, actually calls connectivity to be productivity. And so there's a World Bank study that shows, World Bank study for 120 low and middle income countries that show that a 10% increase in broadband penetration increases the GDP by about 1.38%. So it's a multiplier effect that the productivity gains that come through the workplace bring in a lot more foreign direct investment, et cetera, to increase the GDP. And so the UN has been working towards making increasing broadband deployment option a top priority for developing countries. And the goal that they've set is by 2015, all countries in the world should have national broadband plans. By September of last year, about 119 countries did have national broadband plans. Most of them were developed countries. And the developing countries that did have national broadband plans, there's no guarantee that these plans are going to work or that they're tailored towards their local communities. And so I wanted to study this in a lot more detail, and that's when I started working with Verizon. And so when I started talking with Verizon last semester, they asked me to come in and evaluate US's leadership position in broadband, in certain areas of broadband, and to actually figure out where the US actually stands in broadband. There's an OECD study that's been going around that shows that the average speeds in the US are ranked 15th amongst the OECD countries. And Verizon wanted me to know exactly what these broadband measurements actually do measure, how broadband speeds are measured, and what can the US do to be at the very top. The other thing that they talked about was the FCC, as I mentioned earlier, is doing incentive auctions, and they're going to reallocate the spectrum. So Verizon wanted me to look at the proposals being submitted to the FCC by other companies such as Google and Microsoft and see what uses they were putting the spectrum to and figure out how their uses differed from the other companies' uses. And lastly, but most importantly, Verizon wanted me to communicate technical information to a non-technical audience. So for example, my boss at Verizon gave presentations to congressmen and staffers about technology issues such as online banking or mobile banking, etc. And so I was supposed to put this technical information in a version that was easily understandable by audiences that were really smart but didn't come from a technical background. In terms of my deliverables, I've been working on 3 or 4 projects over the last 3 months. Some of which are policy briefs of Verizon. So a policy brief is essentially a very detailed background information, a lot of research involved in particular areas. I was looking at broadband competition in the US and economic impact of broadband in the US, etc. The other thing I was doing was data visualization, and this is something that I had to learn on the fly. I did a graduate certificate while I was at CU in Science and Technology Policy, and I learned to deal with large data sets and extracting the useful information out of large data sets and presenting it in a format that was useful. But while I was working at Verizon, I also realized that not a lot of people care about actual reports. You have to present it in a graphical format that's a lot more useful. And so I had to learn a lot of data visualization techniques over Excel and other softwares, which would have been helpful if I had taken a data visualization class while I was here. Lastly, I was writing blogs, working with my boss to write blogs about what we'd been doing on Verizon's public policy website to disseminate the information that we were working on to the rest of the world. And I was also representing Verizon and attending a lot of events in DC, such as the State of the Net conference and the Free State Foundation events over there. In terms of my learnings while I was there in DC, one of the things that I've learned is that lawyers in DC will tell you the way they draft the policy is the most important thing. The technologists will tell you the technology is the most important thing. You can't disobey the laws of physics. And I had the same impression going into DC, as I come from a technology background. But what I've learned is that, what we've seen with the gun laws day before yesterday as well, was you have to have influential people on your side to actually get these policies through. You may be talking about a lot of common sense policies, but they're not going to pass if you don't have the people and the people with the power to support your policies. The second thing that I learned was that the implementing body also needs to have authority and capability to implement such policies. The FCC has come under a lot of direct criticism to not implement the National Broadband Plan very well. I tend to disagree, but this is especially more relevant to developing community circumstances where the national regulators do not have the authority to regulate big telcos that operate in their countries, or even if they do not have the capability to implement such plans properly. Lastly, but most importantly, the dynamics for the developing world are very different from what we see in the US. And I gave a presentation while I was at Verizon about the internet and technology policy issues in Pakistan. And one of the things that I understood was that the policy needed to be a lot more holistic. So broadband deployment was a key factor, but for broadband adoption, you also needed to have applications on top of broadband so people would actually adopt broadband, and then you'd have the GDP benefits that come along with it. The second thing that Joellen also mentioned was human capacity building is a huge thing. You need to tell people the kind of things that they can do with broadband, and we take it for granted over here in the US, but this is something that you learn when you travel in developing countries a lot, that people do not know the benefits that they can achieve from such a marvelous technology. And so in the end, I'd like to leave you with this quote from Ban Ki-moon, who's the Secretary General of the UN, who says that broadband is not just important for sustainable development, but it's also for economic prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. At the end, I'd like to thank Verizon. It was amazing working for them. I could walk into anybody's office and ask any stupid question that I wanted. For Fulbright for funding my program here and the practicum itself, for Revi, Joel, Rashay, everybody at Atlas for making this experience wonderful for me, and the Center of Science and Technology Policy Research, where I did my graduate certificate in Science and Technology Policy. Last but not the least, I'd love to thank Professor Dale Hatfield, Preston Patton, and Dick Green, who not just made this internship possible or this practicum possible, but opened a lot of doors for me while I was there in Washington, D.C. Thank you.